Hello, it's Ray again from Then and Now, and I'm going to continue with my look back at the history of my hometown in Northampton. And today I'm going to talk about the 16th century in particular, and pretty much concentrate on how the Reformation changed the nature of the town and its culture. As we all know, the Reformation was a seismic event in the history of the country. And if you had walked through Northampton in 1500, you would have found that it was dominated by religious buildings. It was almost like a monastery with a market attached. Church towers, abbey roofs, bells ringing from various churches, All Saints, monks chanting from St Andrew's Priory, and friars preaching on street corners. It was that kind of town. It was a bustling market town, but very, very religious. There were 6 churches, 2 friars, and 2 friaries, sorry, and a whole network of monasteries and nunneries, including Dalbury Abbey, which is still there today, which was the home of the Augustinian nuns. And St James Abbey, Benedictine house, which was very famous at the time for its hospitality. And they weren't just religious centres in those days, they were landlords, employers, hospitals, schools, all rolled into one. And they owned nearly a third of the town and its surrounding areas. The abbot of St James and the prior of St Andrews were at the very top of the town's society. They were spiritual and political figures who could rival the mayor for influence. So when the church began to fall, Northampton was bound to feel it more than most. And well before Henry VIII made his momentous break from Rome, the town had already had a rebellious streak. In the late 1300s, there was an Oxford scholar called John Wycliffe, and his followers known as Lollards. And they all began to question the authority of the Pope and demand that the Bible be read in English, because in those days it was always read in Latin. And Northampton became one of the Lollards' strongholds. In the early 15th century, there was a knight called Sir John Oldcastle, and he was an early Lollard leader, if you want to call it that, and he found sympathisers in Northampton. And by the early 1500s, copies of Wycliffe's English version of the Bible were circling underground in the town, even though it was very dangerous to own them. So when the Reformation began, which it did in London, obviously, Northampton didn't resist. On the contrary, it was ready for it. As we all know, Henry VIII was desperate for a male heir and wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, and the Pope wouldn't let him. And so Henry did what he thought was a good move, and basically said, well, in that case, the churches in England will be ruled by me, not by the Pope, and thus formed the Church of England. And between 1538, 1540, he just ransacked, wrecked, dissolved just about everything that was to do with the Catholic Church. And St Andrew's Priory in Northampton, St James's Abbey and Delapre Abbey were all dissolved. The King's Commissioners arrived, stripped the churches of silver, melted all the relics, the gold relics, smashed statues, sent the monks and the nuns away to fend for themselves. There was no real violence from the clergy, from the nuns or the monks. In fact, somebody recorded that they left with quiet obedience but sorrow. And of course, all the bells fell silent. The lands were seized by the crown and then quickly sold off because the king needed the money. And the great families of Northamptonshire, Spencers of Althorpe, who's still around, Diana, if you remember, the Knightleys of Fawsley and Fawsley Hall, and the Montagues of Boughton, snapped them up very quickly. They bought them from the king and became very rich on them. But the town's old Catholic clerical landlords vanished to be replaced by those Protestant gentry. But the town didn't sink into ruin. In fact, quite the opposite. The merchants and the craftsmen, artisans who had always chafed under the church control suddenly found that they had room to expand and breathe. And old monastic workshops were opened as tanneries and smithies and all that kind of thing, and the market expanded. And in fact, it was about this time that Northampton began to develop the leather and shoemaking trades, which eventually would define its nature. So the Reformation, yes, it was a religious revolution, but it also triggered an economic revolution, certainly in Northampton and in towns over the rest of England. The loss of the charity that the Catholic monasteries showed hit hard. The poor who'd once been fed by the abbeys had nowhere to go. So the corporation of the town, the then governors of the town, began to organise some civic poor relief, and by 1550s we had, we in Northampton had one of the first parish-based welfare systems in England. And it was a sign really that civic obligation took over from religious obligation, if you like. In fact, we were one of the most, Northampton was one of the most enthusiastic reforming towns in the country. And when the Bible was finally printed in English, which I think was about 1539, copies were displayed in local churches, unheard of before then. Crowds gathered to hear the readings, often led by fiery preachers, which you can still hear on United States television. People like Thomas Bentham, who would later become the Bishop of Coventry, Lichfield, under Queen Elizabeth I. And he was born, funnily enough, quite close to Northampton, and his Protestantism matched the mood of the town perfectly. Um, and then during Edward VI's short reign, reform just surged ahead, really. Latin services were replaced by the Book of Common Prayer. The pulpit became the centre of worship, and the sermon, in those days anyway, was the highlight of a Sunday. Now, for a short period, when Mary Tudor came to the throne, she tried to restore Catholicism, but she didn't last long. Well, she arrested a few people and burnt a few places, but the old faith just didn't take root. And when Elizabeth I came to power, she introduced her religious settlement, I think it was called, in 1559, and Northampton was already living by the rules of the Protestants. And in fact, by the end of the 16th century, Northampton had a reputation as being the godly town, meaning it was a Puritan one. Puritan in those days meant that, they agreed with Protestantism, but they even wanted it to go further. They didn't think that it was religious enough, if you like. So it's a very strict way of looking at it. Ministers were very strict in Northampton. Magistrates were moralists, if you like, moralising. All Saints Church, under preachers like John Dodd, who was nicknamed the Dechologist with his obsession of the Ten Commandments, became a centre of intense devotion. I mean, it really was. Dodd moved to Forsley, Forsley Hall's lovely. But his sermons were copied and circulated throughout the country. The town council banned drunkenness, good luck with that. Gambling, good luck with that. And dancing on Sundays. Education and Bible reading absolutely flourished. Literacy rose faster than anywhere else in the country. And even the architecture of the town changed. Church walls were whitewashed, stained glass were smashed, and old altars were replaced by wooden tables. The focus was on the word, the book, not the image. So what did it really do? What did the Reformation really do to Northampton? It turned a clerical town, really deeply religious town, into a civic one. The church lost its lands, but in their place grew, if you like, economic confidence amongst the merchants and artisans, and the preachers, saying that religion was a matter of conscience and not of hierarchy. The town became better off, more literate, more self-disciplined, and also more argumentative, and more politically aware, which we will see when we discuss the next century. Spirit of independence within the town would flourish and become more and more visible in the next century. And when we'll talk about that next time, I won't go into it now. But we will discuss in the next episode how the Catholic Church in Rome reacted to all this, and how that affected Northampton. And then we'll move on to the 17th century and see what happened then. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this shorter episode, and I'll talk to you again soon.